The wheel of time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. Each week, we will be reading, discussing, and digesting a small selection from Robert Jordan's fantasy opus. This quest is led by Tylor, a true Wheel of Time warrior.
I have all stories, ages that were and that will be. And I'll be joined by Greg, a complete novice to the Wheel of Time.
The Wheel of Time and the wheel of a man's life turn alike without pity or mercy.
Join us each week as we read the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time, traveling deeper and deeper through the glass columns.
But what does that even mean?
No. You don't get to find out yet.
Hello and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read-along podcast. We are so excited that you have chosen to join us again. I, of course, am one of your hosts, Greg, and joining me tonight is Tylor, the real wit and wisdom of the podcast. Tylor, how are you today?
I am doing very well. It is getting towards the time of year when students are arriving on campuses, and that means that I get to teach students and not worry about research for a little while, and I will take it. How are things going for you, Greg?
I'm feeling that kind of end of summer blues. It's like I did like all I could. I couldn't have had a better summer, but then I'm still like, what? I have to like dress in grown-up clothes and not just Star Wars t-shirts. No, I don't like this. So, but that meant it was the perfect time to have a triple header of chapters for our weekly show this week. So again, if you are coming to us right from the last episode, we said in the future we'll try to stick to 2, but there was a good reason to do 3 chapters this week. And if you're reading right along with us, I think you now know that reason. So tonight we will be discussing 3 chapters: Chapter 22, A Path Chosen; Chapter 23, Wolfbrother; and Chapter 24, Down the Arinelle. Arinelle?
I think Arinelle. I'm not sure.
All I knew is I was like, don't say Arendelle. It's not Aaron. Don't say Arendelle. All right. So really, truly, the reason is because I think we're going to have a very quick discussion of the first of these chapters, but, it should still be exciting because that discussion is going to be so short. I think we have time to squeeze in an ill-advised discussion of a visual artifact in an audio medium. Tylor, what do you have for us tonight?
Yes, so this week we are actually going to be exploring the second set of covers that are available for The Eye of the World, and in fact for all of the books in the Wheel of Time series. So thus far we have seen the original classic cover painted by Daryl Sweet with the moon and the armor, and it's beautiful. However, for a long time, that was the only cover of this book until it was decided that these books would finally make their way into the ebook format. It should be noted that both Robert Jordan and later on his widow and heir to his estate, Harriet, both of them were somewhat opposed to the introduction of ebooks at the same time that a book was being launched, right? They really felt like getting on the New York Times bestseller list was crucial to the success of a book. I don't think they're wrong. And so for a long time, they kind of resisted the idea of launching ebooks because they wanted to make sure, at least in the first run, their paperbacks and their hardcovers were selling effectively. However, after the 14th book was published, we finally got ebooks, I think like 4 or 5 months after the final book was published. And when that happened, to help celebrate the fact that the books would be arriving in the ebook format, we started to get Tor, the publisher, basically commissioned a number of different artists to each paint a new cover for each of the books, except for the final book. Book 14 actually shares a cover across both editions. But today we are going to be talking about The Eye of the World ebook cover. That's the easiest thing to Google if you're looking for the image to take a look at. It is a watercolor painting of presumably Rand on the mast of a ship, and in the background we see a silver tower, which is described in one of the chapters that we read later on. So I wanted to, as we've often done with these images, start by just letting you kind of give your thoughts as someone who doesn't know the mythology as well, and then I can dive in with any symbolism or anything additional that comes to mind.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a striking cover. And actually, when you sent me this image to warn me we were going to have this discussion, I had killed some time at a Barnes and Noble during my vacation, and I'd seen this cover, and it had actually stood out to me on the shelf. If I'm not mistaken, I think it's the trade paperback size as
Yes.
opposed to the mass market. And a lot of publishers do that move where they make the trade editions look really nice, like particularly beautiful, so that you're tempted to grab the $15 book instead of the $5 book, or roughly speaking anyway. Inflation, those are probably both wrong.
Not even close.
Yeah. So I did actually think when I saw it, I was like, I had that moment where you're like, oh, I wish I had that cover, right? Because I, again, am working with the most boring of boring mass market paperback covers that is just kind of blue. So I think it's striking and it's really nice. When I look at it, my eye is drawn towards Rand's shirt, which is very Fabio / Jerry Seinfeld puffy shirt. Very, not what in my head I was picturing the shepherd goat herd wearing at all. And the way he is posed around the mast of the ship also kind of looks like a romance novel, right?
Yeah.
It's like they slid out the beautiful scantily clad woman and just put in a post, turning him into a pole dancer. So I like the image. I don't mean to make fun of it, but it has more of that feel and somewhat less of the wonder. The exception to that to me is his facial expression, which the way he's looking is kind of in awe or, towards the horizon type of attitude. And I find that particularly alluring myself, not in the scantily clad woman type of way, but, the way in which he's kind of embodying that spirit is something of escapism, a fantasy that I would be interested in and maybe would grab this cover. I'm going to be honest with you, because that's what this podcast is for, my therapy. I didn't even notice the silver tower. It just didn't register in the background there. And then when you just said that a moment ago, I was like, oh yeah, he's right. There it is. So, all right, fill in what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I also enjoy this cover quite a bit. I think when you originally texted me about it, you referred to it as like the Penguin Classic cover. And that's actually what I like about it, right? It just feels so, it feels like this could be the cover of a Jane Austen novel. And it's not, but it works. That being said, this is my least favorite of all of the ebook trade paperback covers, simply because what I generally like about these covers is that they feel a little bit more accurate to the world and accurate to the plot, whereas the Daryl Sweet covers, like we talked about with the first one, it's like, here are some people on horses, right? He does beautiful portraits. They work really well, but they don't feel especially Wheel of Timey. My big complaint about this is, why in the world is Rand's hair not red?
Yes.
Like it's a little catch. Auburn, but that's not what we're looking like. It's the only cover where I look at it and go, that doesn't look like the character to me. Every other one of them matches up pretty well. The only other thing that I'll note is, to me, this is a really curious choice for the cover image of this book. Every other one of the Daryl Sweet covers is kind of a big moment where all of the characters are gathered together, and so you get like lots of character portraits. All of the ebook covers are generally kind of important moments from each of the book. They pull out a lot of really valuable kind of either plot moments or, in some cases, big thematic moments for the characters. And this is the odd cover out for me on that standard, right? Rand isn't an especially nautical character. He's not a character who would wear the puffy shirt. And the moment that is portrayed in this, A, didn't happen. Rand was on the ground when the tower went by. But B, the moment where he's up on the mast is not a like happy moment. As we'll talk about it later, he's kind of like losing his mind and laughing through the whole thing. So it just feels a little odd, given that the benefit of a lot of the rest of the covers in this series are their accuracy to the world.
Yeah, on the Penguin Classics front, those books often use a famous piece of art, right? So they are usually a painting, but they're I'm forever going into a museum and seeing, a piece of Americana art. I'm like, oh, that's, my Antonia, even though it has nothing to do with the novel or what have you. So it's interesting that they are then commissioned and then contain those inaccuracies
Yeah.
that you noted. My only other sillier note is that, as always, I'm splitting my attention between books, and my other book I'm reading right now is one of the Patrick O'Brian Master and Commander Jack Aubrey books, and to me, this cover is very evocative of that series. It's like, if I picked this up and I didn't read the back, I just judged a book by its cover, I would be like, oh, I'm in for like some seafaring adventure and
some swashbuckling.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't know if what's to come, but I'm assuming that this is not the tone of this actual book. So yeah. So are they trying to, I mean, that's obviously a very successful book series. Probably, I don't even know. Would that be probably not more successful than Wheel of Time, but somewhere on the same tier, I might imagine. One is pure dad, one is pure fantasy lovers, but yeah, it's kind of like if I saw those on the shelf, they would make sense together. I think those covers tend to be more ships than without people, but yeah.
I think that's all that I had for this cover. But I did.
Well, good. Start describing the chapter then.
I did actually want to add one more thing before we describe this chapter, which is that
before I get angry at you.
Yeah, apparently. I don't know where that came from. Thus far, if you are a show watcher, you have basically been reading what could very well kind of gone into the script of the first 2 episodes, right? Leaving Shadar Lagoth is the end of episode 2. And we are now about to embark on a section of the book that either doesn't appear in the show at all or has been massively condensed for the show, depending on which section we're talking about. So just be aware, for those of you who are show watchers, you're going to get a lot of new info in the next couple hundred pages that wasn't in the show. And interestingly, the show seems to be playing around with when events happen a little bit. So it seems like some of the things that the show skipped over here, you'll be seeing in season 2. All of this is to say, timey-wimey, it's not going to match up perfectly if you're a show watcher, but that's okay. That being said, let's then dive into chapter 22, A Path Chosen. And in this chapter, Perrin wakes up, he looks for some tracks, he finds Egwene, and they choose a path. That's the chapter. This is why we were able to fit in 3 this week. It was about 5 pages long, not much happened. Greg, what was your reaction upon reading this?
Yeah, this is definitely the least notes I've made on a chapter that like you said, very simple, very kind of straightforward. I guess what became notable as we continued reading is Perrin awakens here from a dream of home, right? And later chapters, as we'll continue in this episode to discuss, the dreams return to the kind of haunted Beazalon kind of influenced dreams. Yeah. So I didn't kind of click on that at first, but then when I was like, oh, right, it's funny because the experience is kind of like we take these gaps between episodes. So I have gaps between reading, and then it was like it registered again, like, oh, right, like dreams have been significant and of late been troubled. And this is kind of a pure dream. I don't know. Does that mean, well, Perrin has some of the other kind later, so it doesn't really define his character at all necessarily. But that, and then I guess just relief that Egwene was okay. I didn't really think she was gone, but I also thought the fact that she was kind of put together, warming herself by a fire, just again showed, it's the classic Hermione thing. It's like, why are we paying attention to the boys? Like she's clearly on top of things and in charge. So yeah, what were some of your thoughts on this brief chapter?
Yeah, I mean, really what I get out of this brief chapter is, one, I think there's some really interesting like Perrin character building, just seeing him work through problems and kind of prioritize and think about what is, at the top of his list versus what is the bottom. What is he willing to trade off from? I think in the first introduction we got to Perrin a couple chapters ago, it was really emphasized how kind of deliberate and thoughtful he is. So it was nice to kind of see that play out again. Other than that, I'm just excited these 2 characters are together. These are 2 of the like 3 or 4 like cornerstone Why I Love Wheel of Time characters. And so when they buddy up, I'm like, yeah, this is the good stuff in this series. That's kind of all I've got for this chapter, unless you had other stuff.
Well, just in that regard, and this carries on in the next one, it's like, okay, this was the final team to make sure we had accounted for everybody who got kind of splintered at the fallen city. And so, I know how these things work. We're going to alternate between these different teams. And I was thinking, my top team would be Rand and Matt and Tom on the ship. Like that's the one I'm like most interested in. But I think I would slide this pair into number 2. And I think they even kind of really owned that in the next chapter.
Yeah.
Which reminded me like, oh right, but we also still have the Aes Sedai, her ward, and that's not the right word, is it?
Warder.
Yeah, Warder. Yeah, I was like, it's not Robin. Yeah. And then the Nynaeve. Yeah. So I'm less interested in that team now, and totally okay if, like, in these 3 chapters we stick with these 2 groups. Yeah, I mean, the plan to just go to Camelin and just kind of hope the others find them seemed a little vague, and then that gets called into question next chapter. But also, Egwene seems to have a sense of something like the silver pieces, so that she kind of has that faith, and it's like, yeah, we can go with that. It's interesting to see where she's kind of letting him pretend he's the leader and where he's really leading at times. So that's literally all I have. Nothing else left on my page. Would you like to talk to us about chapter 23 now?
Yeah, let's move on from chapter 22. Not much happened. So in chapter 23, Wolfbrother, we first see a little bit more of the tension between Egwene and Perrin in terms of when are they riding the horse and who's making decisions about where they're going. Very quickly, it becomes a problem of food and where they're finding it. They're able to kind of subsistence level get by, but that's really all that's happening until eventually they smell some smoke. They go to a camp, and then Perrin meets this, wild man in furs, Elias Machera. He shares his food with them. They talk briefly. It turns out that Perrin and Egwene are bad at directions and would have gone kind of straight into nowhere forever if they had kept walking. And Elias's friends soon arrive. It turns out that his friends are 4 wolves. Elias also has yellow eyes like the wolves. And after a brief conversation, it turns out Elias says the wolves are aware that Perrin can also speak with and communicate with wolves in the same way that Elias does. We then learn a little bit about Elias's backstory, why he stays away from society the way that he does. And finally, Elias offers Perrin to basically join the pack and go with them, and Perrin decides not to. And so Elias says that he is going to at least give them guidance on their way to Camelin and possibly further. And to me, this is one of my favorite chapters, or at least a chapter that begins some of my favorite plot lines. I find Perrin and Elias and the wolves to be infinitely fascinating. So I'm curious what your take was first time diving into this new mythology.
Definitely a moment where it was another one of those, oh, there's this in this world, right? Like, it's not necessarily another race or creature, but it's another kind of talent or skill. And then I had the only logical reaction one can have. I said, in touch with the ground, I'm on the hunt, I'm after you. I'll stop singing Hungry Like a Wolf, but it was like, oh, they're hungry like the wolf. And I started singing Duran Duran, even though I would not consider myself to be a Duran Duran fan. But the lyrics work kind of oddly well, having just Googled them while you were talking. Stalked in the forest, too close to hide. I'll be upon you by the moonlight side. Do. High blood drumming on your skin. It's so tight. You feel my heat. I'm just a moment behind.
Okay, we don't want to get the explicit label, Greg. Let's back off a little.
Also, we'd owe some money to Duran Duran, and their lawyers are definitely coming after us.
They're better than ours because we don't have one.
Fair. We have like some friends who maybe got halfway through law school. That's enough. That's plenty. So on the serious note, very cool, very exciting to meet this character. And, I kind of, liked that they seem to have a better deception game at first, that they can kind of come up with the story quickly, and they're doing that kind of tag team improv game very successfully,
Yeah.
except for the fact that wolves can see through it entirely and it becomes irrelevant no matter how good it was. So I was both proud of them for their attempt and their growth. But then I was not impressed by how quickly they folded, because he was like, we can tell you're lying. And then they're like, okay, here's everything in minute detail.
This reminds me of something that has happened in every Dungeons and Dragons campaign I've ever run at least once, where the party comes up with an amazingly detailed, like specific plan that is ruined by one very obvious detail that they forgot about, right? And I feel like that's exactly what's going on here. It's like, I rolled a natural 20 on my deception check. Yeah, but no.
So to tackle it a little more chronologically, you know, I liked the back and forth between Egwene and Perrin in the opening. I liked the way Perrin was presented struggling with leadership. To me, the goal was to show he's really not ready for this, but being a character of good courage, he's going to try. And the way he kept saying, like, oh, leaders shouldn't have to deal with this, or they should do that, they should do that. It's very endearing, right? It's you know, somebody trying to step up. You know, maybe since we're both teachers, we see that a lot. You're like, okay, this is definitely not a passing paper, but I got to tell you, like, it impresses me with the effort and the spirit that's here. And I just kind of had that kind of attachment to him.
Yeah, you're much nicer than I am. I'm more of a like, no, let's throw you to the wolves kind of guy. But no, I think it's a really well drawn scene, and I think it's really interesting. It plays well because it gives us a good insight into both characters, right? I think there's both what you're describing, the Perrin side of like, what is leadership? What does it mean to be followed? What does it mean to lead? You know, kind of figuring out how does that work even when it's just Egwene, right? When do you step up? When do you let the other person use their expertise? But I think it's also a really interesting kind of Egwene scene, right? We've seen kind of the thoughtful, you know, willing to think it out Egwene, and we've also seen just like, I am having fun on this adventure Egwene, and it's nice to see kind of the balance between those as she's also figuring out, when do I defer versus when is it just like, no, it's my way or the highway, this is something I'm not gonna let up on. And I think it's a really it's a convincing argument for both sides because you believe both of them.
Yeah, it's again totally random, but we are recording this to pull back the curtain the week of the first episode of She-Hulk. Did you watch She-Hulk, the first one?
I have not yet.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm not going to really spoil it, but there's a fantastic scene where Bruce Banner is trying to explain to Jessica Waters like how to control her angers, and she's like, dude, let me tell you what it's like to be a woman. And like goes through like, yeah, I always have to hold my anger in check, because if I, you know, yell at the guy who cat calls me, then I'm the bitch or whatever. There's that explicit tag coming. So why I bring that up is because I think that is very similar to this vibe here. There's a way in which Perrin is ready to step up, and Egwene's like, yeah, I've been playing this my whole life. Like I've been there. And you're right that there are these different modes of Egwene, but the role of, you know, women, unfortunately, is to kind of put up with men kind of working through their BS while they're kind of quietly in control and on top of things. So maybe the other moment I'll draw from that section is just to say, Perrin is really assertive, maybe the most assertive he is in this section, when he finds out she has the one power. So she has used it to start a fire before. He checks their snares, goes hunting, comes back a little too quickly, and catches her struggling to try to use it again. And he kind of harshly scolds her and is like, nope, like I'll use a fire arrow. Do not try to do that again. And I felt like that was a moment where he was out of line. And yet she didn't necessarily react that way, or maybe again, she just internalized the man acting like a jerk. So how did you read that moment?
Yeah, I think two things. One is I always forget, you know, from the early moments of this series, how much the Two Rivers folk are kind of biased against the one power and how much they almost seem to like fear and hate it. The moment that brought that out for me a couple of chapters ago was when Nynaeve arrived in, I think, the chapter of the wisdom, and was just like, so she thought of Aes Sedai as like evil, dark things that no one should be associated with. And so I see that same tension here, right? Perrin, I think, is responding out of that, no one used the one power where we were from. We were taught it was evil place. But I actually think it's interesting. If I recall correctly, Perrin tells her, promise me that you won't use the power again tonight. And I think that Egwene's response, let me see if I can find this specifically, but I'm pretty sure Egwene doesn't say, no, I won't use the power. She just says, I won't. And I think it's reasonable to read that as her saying, I won't promise you that. So it's ambiguous the way it's worded, but I think it is actually potentially readable in both ways.
Okay. My last note on the pre-Elias Machera is just to say there is this fleeting reference to the fact that he's having dreams of Beelzemon, and particularly that they involve a maze. And we probably don't have to say much about that until next chapter, but to note that they are present across these individuals, as we can see again, like they were back at the city.
Well, and this is actually something that Robert Jordan is very effective at, is he will often give his characters either in the real world, obviously if they're in the same place we know it's the same time, but he'll also often give characters like the same dream, so you can sync up the timelines and know when things are actually happening simultaneously. And this dream is very helpful for that, right? We know that maybe like 2/3 of the way through Perrin's trip syncs up to the beginning of the next chapter. So that's actually something that's useful to keep an eye on.
That's true.
But now I think let's just talk about Elias, because he's an interesting character. He's the first one that we've gotten basically since the Two Rivers, a new major character. So I'm curious how he played for you, whether you were suspicious or, kind of immediately willing to go with him. How do you think about Elias?
If I met a strange man in the woods, I'd just go with him. I just hang. I mean, he's cool, right? Like, he feels a little bit like a werewolf, but clearly not. Like he's human and he's part of there. This section feels like if the Fellowship just broke, then this is our Sam and Frodo in a lot of ways, because it's just the pair of them. And this would be where Gollum enters. But the Tolkien character I would compare him to instead is it Bjorn, the bear man in The Hobbit?
That dude.
Not Tom Bombadil, which
That's
I was
what
tempted with
thinking.
at first. Yeah, he's not merry enough, I don't think, or eccentric
That's
enough. So I thought of that character who's kind of gruff and kind of rough and very much in touch with nature. And I think I'm thinking more of the movie version. It's been a while since I read The Hobbit, and God, I shouldn't watch the Hobbit movies, but I do sometimes. So
They're not good.
I liked that character a lot. I was suspicious of him. I think wolves are so often evil that the fact that he was so in touch with the wolves made me skeptical at first. And again, the Tolkien bias, the wolves are on the dark side. The goblins ride the wolves, right? And so I think it became clear across the chapter that these guys are good, right? Like they're forces for good, and they, are worried about the Trollocs and the half-men. So while they're not aligned with the Aes Sedai, clearly, it does seem like we should trust him, and that, he's kind of a reluctant helper in that classic sense. He's like, all right, well, you're gonna die if I don't help you a little ways, so I might as well help you a little ways. You seem to have great affection for him. Is it just because he's cool?
Some of it is that he's cool. I will say I have some affection for Elias. I think he's a good character, but to some degree he's kind of here to be the exposition dump, right? He needs to tell Perrin Wolfbrothers are things. He needs to explain how it works and what it feels like. To me, what I really like about kind of the Elias scenes are two things. One, I find the wolves to be fascinating characters. And we'll probably talk about this a little bit later, kind of the almost political intrigue of the wolf pack that we get a quick glimpse into, I think is really cool, and I enjoy that section a lot. The other thing that I find so interesting about Elias is that he typifies a very kind of archetype that we've all seen in a lot of, science fiction stories, right? When you first glance at him and you're hearing, like furs, and you kind of think like barbarian, right? You think like that Conan direction, or kind of the berserker type that we typically
right.
Conan
O'Brien, that is, not
yes, exactly.
Conan, yeah. The pompadour, the funny string dance. Yeah, got it. I'm right on the same page as you.
I think I could be wrong about this. I think Robert Jordan actually wrote one or two Conan books before he started doing the Wheel of Time books. Don't quote me on that. I'll double check that is true, but I think that's the case. But I love that we get that kind of like tropey archetype look to this character, and then we get what turns out to be a very like thoughtful, deliberate, quiet, I stay away from society not because they have shunned me, but because I just like wolves better. And I appreciate that kind of set up and pull the rug out moment for kind of a veteran fantasy person, because I think you very easily could read it in that, I think Bjorn is even like a druid or something. Like he has some sort of like nature magic power, and Elias is just like a dude, and I kind of like that.
Well, I want to piggyback that by saying probably, to be completely honest, one of my favorite bits of writing so far in the entire book is when he's explaining Dapple, one of the wolves, and he says, and I'll just read just the piece, her name isn't Dapple. It's something that means the way shadows play on a forest pool at a midwinter dawn, with the breeze rippling the surface and the tang of ice when the water touches the tongue, and a hint of snow before nightfall in the air. But that isn't quite it either. You can't say it in words. It's more of a feeling. That's the way wolves talk. That is just amazing. And, it's not revolutionary as a concept. I think this comes up in fantasy from time to time, right? It reminds me of the linguistics class cliche about like the Eskimos have 70 words for snow or whatever. Obviously language is built around its sensations, but I have never heard it quite so beautifully stated that single word dapple means this entirely engrossing feeling that is second nature to wolves, and that's how they communicate with each other, and you just can't begin to comprehend it. It's one of those, like you said, it's one of those upending moments, because again, wolves, barbaric, they're gonna tear people apart, they're gonna rend flesh. No, actually, they're going to call each other something incredibly beautiful and poetic, and makes one realize why Elias may reject humans in favor of wolves.
And it actually reminds me, the thing that immediately jumps out as you mentioned that is I have tried, I'm not very good at languages, but I have tried to learn American Sign Language. I've taken a couple of classes, and names in ASL remind me of that same thing, right? They're often just a single symbol, but they're often made up of, several signs. Your name might be an L in the position of hat doing the motion of something. And that idea of like names almost as stories, because you're given your name in the ASL community in many cases. And so that idea of wolves kind of choosing the moment or the element of themselves that then becomes that name, right? Like Dapple is named that because that's a thing she loves, or that's a moment that really typifies her. And so the idea that you can even just meet 4 wolves and find out their names are Dapple, Burn, Hopper, and Wind, and you've kind of got at least a rough sense of all of those wolves. I like that idea.
Yeah, and then the fact that they have this ability to see through the lies means they're going to be a useful ally, right? And that that's something not to lose sight of when so many of our characters are being less than forthcoming. They're often truthful, but it's more lies of omission than anything else. And then in that conversation, Elias drops that he is actually on the run from the Aes Sedai. Did I sense that correctly? It's one of the subgroups.
Yeah, so it sounds like the Red Aja wanted to try to cut him off from the wolves the same way they cut off men from channeling. Elia says it wouldn't have worked, but that's what they were trying to do. And then Elia says in escaping, he had to kill at least several warders. So, not great.
Yeah, and so aligning his abilities then with the one power in some sense, right? Because that would be the faction that kills the men who display the ability to use the power. So that's curious, especially given the probably most important revelation, which is they see this ability in Perrin. I definitely thought of Luke Skywalker, like, you have that power too, which, the wolves express it, correct me if I'm wrong, as he is halfway between worlds. He is of the world of wolves and men, which is very cool and very unexpected, because again, maybe I'd inadvisably written off Perrin a bit. I know you've always told me he's one of your favorites, but like, what was special about him? And now we're like, oh, okay, he's another chosen one. He's just the wolf chosen one, as the case may be.
And I actually, when you were talking about Elias and his history with the Aes Sedai, you mentioned the Red Aja, but I actually wanted to just drop in something that he called the Aes Sedai that I think is a phrase we haven't encountered yet. Because he says that when they tried to gentle him, he told them straight to their faces that they were Black Aja and that they served the Dark One. So we now have, obviously, if it's an insult like that, there probably isn't an actual official Black Aja, but we now have this idea of groups of Aes Sedai who serve the Dark One, and that's kind of an unsettling thought, given that the whole point of the quest so far has been get to where the Aes Sedai are, you'll be fine.
Yeah, thanks for unsettling me, Tyler. And then, I think in those opening chapters, the Aes Sedai felt like they're just pure goodness, get to them, like you're saying. And now we keep adding complications to that. And while the book is based on the dichotomy, the more factions, these wolves seem between the powers. I don't want to say just like in the gray or anything like that, but like they are a different faction, and we're adding we're crowding the game board with more and more types of pieces. Again, I assume as somebody who's read fantasy that like these are going to start to all overlap and push into each other. And if there's some cataclysmic war to come, then no one will escape, right? The trees will have to start walking and talking, as Lord of the Rings taught us. So, that's what I had for this chapter. I did note the moment you referenced earlier, which is that the wolves have a pack that it has dynamics going on and power struggles going on, which again just shows that they're more complicated than humans, perhaps.
Yeah, I just really loved that scene where Elias is kind of narrating that like Byrne could be the head of the pack if he wanted to be, but Dapple is so smart, none of the men in the pack are willing to overthrow her. And I thought that was both kind of a fun, interesting moment. As you said, like the lives of wolves are as complicated as the lives of men and women. But I also think it's a fun little throwback to this is kind of exactly what's happening between Perrin and Egwene, right? Is Perrin's, Egwene's like, okay, you can take charge for now, but I'm really the one running the show.
Well, and I went to the whole pack of the four, right? Not just the two of them, but it's 4 and 4. So I guess that could map out a little bit more too. We should know you are a dog person. So that's part of why this is. It also just occurred to me that your wonderful dog Samson hasn't interrupted or cameoed in an episode yet, which is incredible that we're this far.
That is miraculous. I will also let you know one thing that is miraculous is me being referred to as a dog person. I was deathly afraid of dogs until I was like 25, 26.
So all right. So your wife has had a good effect.
Yeah, Wolfbrother was a problem for me. I was like, I don't know about these dogs. Let's dive into chapter 24, however, Flight Down the Arinelle. So in this chapter, we begin with another one of Rand's dreams. He's in like a shifting non-Euclidean is what I wrote down, just a maze that is impossible to figure out. And he seems to be fleeing from Baal-Zaman. Eventually, they encounter one another. Rand pierces his finger on a thorn or something like it. And then we get yet another solid Baal-Zaman monologue. And eventually we reach a moment where there are a bunch of mirrors, and we see thousands of Rands and thousands of Baalzamons, and then their faces like merge and they are one face or something. And then Rand wakes up. He finds out he pricked his finger on a thorn. It's still there. Oh no. That was a very odd, like 2-paragraph section that was blocked off in the book. I don't know why. Anyways, we then are with Rand on Bail Domon's ship. We begin to kind of get a feel for some of the dynamics on the ship with Florin Gelb, who was basically kicked off the ship in the previous chapter once they arrive at Whitebridge, being very upset at the group. Tom seems to be worried about the potential for a mutiny, and so starts, training the boys and being able to do, whatever it is that Gleeman do, and then hopefully also entertain the crew so that they don't mutiny. And we then get a couple of interesting scenes. One is we get Rand going past the silver tower that is depicted on the cover and talking with Bail Domon about a number of other artifacts and interesting sites around the world of potential magical power. We get a scene where Rand climbs up into the rigging of the ship and starts laughing at all of the people below him. Eventually Tom gets him and he does something crazy to get down, and then later on is afraid of how or why he did that. And then finally, we get the reveal that Matt has kept a dagger from Shadar Logoth. Rand is somewhat worried about it, but Matt's not giving up the dagger. And before I throw to you, actually, this is a good place to note. This dagger, I believe in this chapter, is the first time that it is referenced as having a ruby hilt. And that actually makes this the second of Min's foretellings that has shown up in some way or another. She saw a ruby dagger around Matt's head. It's also worth noting she saw a wolf dancing around Perrin's head. So in these 2 chapters, we get our first 2 prophecies, at least partially coming true.
Oh, nice. I didn't catch that. So I'd actually forgotten all about Min. So good to have that reminder. Certainly. Okay. I mean, I'm going to say, where was my head at for this chapter? The dream stuff, I still struggle with. I'm like, okay, he's seeing some funky stuff. And then I was more invested in the ship thing, like I said, because I'm reading these ship books. And the other half, I'm like, oh, I know about rigging. I know about mast. Those books get into minute detail about like the topsail and the forecastle. I'm like, I don't know these things, but I know like rigging. So now kind of scrutinizing the dream a little bit more. I follow a fantastic Twitter account, which is somebody who photoshops Paddington from Paddington into a different movie every day. And recently they did Paddington inside of the, I want to say 1986 classic Labyrinth. So it was one of those MC Escher kind of stairs going every which way and David Bowie in the foreground looking and just Paddington in the background. So with that fresh in my mind in the last week, I was like, oh, this sounds like Labyrinth, because I believe he's chasing the baby at that point in Labyrinth. Maybe Jennifer Connelly's around. I can't remember. And
I watched that movie once at a sleepover. Don't ask me what happens in that movie.
That's too much in some ways. That's one of those ones I loved as a kid. And then when my wife and I were probably in our mid-20s, I'm like, oh, this movie's awesome. You should watch this. And she's like, what is this? Like it didn't work as a first time when you're 20 something. So it felt kind of like that. And then I, of course, with the mirrors went to Last Jedi with Rey snapping her fingers and it echoing through and all that. And certainly got a more sinister sense from this vision than those visions. But and then the last thing I'll say about it is I didn't even remember that he again was affected by something in the dream and it came through. So I'm glad you repeated that in your summary.
Yeah, I had the same reaction. We're both Star Wars fans. I love Rey. We're obviously going to both jump in on The Last Jedi, but I actually
you were going for Paddington and I was so excited. Like, yes. No, go ahead.
I do love me some Paddington. But I was actually going to go to another Star Wars reference. At the end of that sequence where we get the 1,000 mirrors and it's Baalzamon and it's Rand and then suddenly they're one, that actually kind of it made me think of the vision that Luke has on Dagobah after he cuts off the vision of Darth Vader's head and then inside of the helmet is Luke's face. And I thought that weird combination of a moment that happened 20 years before this book came out, and then a movie that riffed on the same idea like 20 years later, all coming together. This scene, it worked for me in a way that some of the other dreams haven't. That being said, I also kind of share your disdain for dream sequences.
Yeah. Oh man, I'm not fast enough. I was trying to do a Benoit Blanc. The donut hole was a smaller donut, because that felt like what you were building, right? And
Yeah.
Ryan Johnson and all that. Yeah. And I guess part of my disdain for dream sequences is like, maybe I said this when we talked about them before, but I feel like it's just a way for an author to show how clever they are. And prophecies feel the same way. It's like, I know what's gonna happen. It's like, yeah, of course you do. Like, it's your design. So so then I was more interested when we get back to the boat. There's clearly tension building on board. And interestingly, it was a little bit between the guests and the crew, but it seemed more about the crew with the crew that let the guests stay, right?
Yeah.
That's more where the tension arises, and that was interesting to me. And again, thinking of a boat full of, even a river boat full of merchants or sailors, I suspect there's essentially real danger there, which Tom then implies or states as he thinks about, well, we need to be ready for real violence here.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting seeing how Rand and Matt view the situation on the ship so differently than Tom does, right? Because Rand and Matt are all focused on, Gelb. They're like, this dude hates us. He's going to try to kill us. And Tom's like, you don't have to worry about one person. One person is easy to deal with. It's the mob that you need to be worried about, right? And so just that recognition by Tom of like, you guys are smart enough to recognize something's going on, but start paying attention to the currents and not the individual pieces. I think it just shows kind of where Tom is at compared to especially Matt and Rand, right? They are as blank of slates as you can get at this point, basically, right? They've had 2 weeks in the wilderness and they're still not playing the game especially well. But I actually, to me, what jumped out in this sequence is less about the kind of tensions on the ship, although I think that's really interesting. It's about, for me, Bail Domon is a really fascinating character. This kind of very gruff, very taskmaster seeming captain who also has time to talk about all of the crazy things that he's seen and discovered around the world with an 18-year-old. And that discussion about the wider world and the wonders that are in it, I thought was really interesting, seeing someone as worldly as Bale, along with Rand being like, well, I saw some fish bones once.
And not to get high-minded or literary on you, but that's a common trope in a lot of sailor books, right? Because historically accurately, ships often had a young cabin boy or somebody very young. So in Moby Dick, it's a character named Pip, and there's always that kind of beauty in the inexperience, kind of through the juxtaposition with the deep experience. And what do sailors have but experience? Go to the right port city and there you go. But I do think that that's, again, a familiar relationship. So it was like, oh, this is, I don't think Rand's about to become, despite what the cover showed, I don't think he's about to enlist or get impressed upon this ship and have to travel on. But there is kind of this way in which a wary old sea captain would gift that to an 18-year-old in kind of a very natural way. And that's, I could sing Lion King to you, but that's essentially the circle of life, right? That when you're at the end of the journey or towards the end of the journey, I'm not going to say this captain's about to die, that comes out there. So the scene on top of the boat, beautiful, really nice. Some good writing, just a beautiful image, and I can see why the cover artist, despite the flaws in their execution, would be drawn to that. So Rand gets out of control, let's just say, meaning the literal sense is he's no longer in control, and scares the crew. The crew shouts, he doesn't react. So then Tom climbs up there, right? Is it Tom who climbs up? And kind of awakens him. So very bizarre. And you know, in my other book somebody just fell off the mast, so I was like, no,
Okay.
buddy. But where my mind went first was back to the charge against the Trollocs when the old blood took over. And I wondered if we were getting a sense here of when Rand is losing control, that he's letting his heritage, his who he is, kind of speak to him more. And so I offered this, I guess, as a half formed theory that if he is you know, inspired by this talk of seeing the world via ship, is he from, and then is, you know, very much at home and very skilled at balancing on a moving yardarm, I think, and then swinging down like, you know, he seemed like the monkey in like the Pirates of the Caribbean movies. So I offer all that to say, it seems to me like that's probably a hint that he is from a seafaring people, that's the stock that, you know, he is of the two rivers, but he is seemingly separate. He was raised there, but from somewhere else. So could this be a hint at who he really is or where he's from? That's where my mind went. I imagine you can't say a lot unless I'm just completely wrong, and then you'll be like, nope, dummy. But that to me was where my mind went in that moment.
First off, I am not going to say no dummy, because it's way more fun to watch you be wrong than to say no dummy. Actually, to me, what this brings to mind is the scene in the previous village that they were in Bearlawn, where Matt upends the cart and it causes the mud to splash on the white cloaks. And that's another moment where Rand kind of loses control, and in both cases he's laughing, right? He laughs at the white cloaks, and that's what gets him in trouble. And then up on the mast, he kind of is laughing at whatever he sees down on the ship, and that seems to disturb the crew. And so to me, those two moments coming together, it makes me wonder kind of what's the pattern, or what's causing these moments to be the ones where he gets out of control. Is it something about you know, tension or fear, right? Those both seem like moments that he could be, you know, afraid of. And as you're saying, if it is, whether it's the old blood or whether it's, you know, something else that's causing, you know, whatever this is, I'm starting to kind of think about the puzzle of like, okay, what are the things that preceded this? What are the, you know, feelings or emotions that might be tied up in these sort of things coming out in that old blood or whatever it is, kind of, you know, coming out. And so as I'm reading this the first time and then many times, I'm just kind of curious, like, what are the clues and what am I missing around this piece? Because this is, to me, like you were saying, sometimes prophecies feel a little too, you know, I'm showing off how clever I am. Moments like this where you can tell something is going on but you're not sure what, that to me is the more subtle version of that, right? It's I'm very clever because I'm not going to tell you that something's happening, but you know something's happening, kind of thing.
Yeah, you know, it's the difference between the murder mystery where the clues are laid out so you can figure it out yourself versus the one that they throw such a curveball in at the end. You're like, oh, I had no shot. That wasn't fun for me, right? You want to puzzle it and you want to figure it out like that beautiful moment just before the characters do, or what have you. So that, I think you're right to point out that that's a much more masterful kind of tool, especially in the way that Robert Jordan wields it, and that's just fun, right? Like that's why we read books. That's why we escape.
We are getting kind of towards the end of this chapter. I was curious whether you had anything before we talked about Matt and the dagger, because that at least is something that we definitely need to make sure we spend a minute on.
That was my last topic, so I don't have anything else before that.
Then let's talk about that. So obviously I had semi spilled the beans, semi pointed out a, you know, odd phrasing of Matt's, but when we see this dagger now for the first time, I'm curious what your response is to how Matt is talking about it, how Rand is reacting to it, and just generally how this scene plays out. Because the object itself obviously is interesting, but the wrangling between the characters, I think, is what makes this sequence work.
more than anything, I was mad at Rand because he's just like, okay, we'll keep it a secret between us. So like I mean, it's a little more, it's kind of a solemn vow almost that
Yeah.
they'll do that. And now there's certainly the way tensions have risen around them, they need to remain allied. So it's not like he can ditch him or have a fight with him at that particular moment. But it was kind of like, of course he did, and of course no good will come of this.
Yeah.
The other familiar trope from lots of different types of art, where like if the characters just had a real conversation, then all the action would go away.
Yeah.
It felt like one of those moments. It's like, well, they
Yeah.
need to start dealing with this and confess that it happened. I think when they were in that city, I likened it to Abu, the monkey from Aladdin.
Yep.
So, it feels like that's why everything has happened the way it's going to happen. And I can't imagine, with the kind of atmosphere of this scene, that it's not going to lead to just more bad things until they rid themselves of it, or perhaps return it to the treasure pile, as the case may have to be. So I think those were the things swirling around for me.
Yeah, I think to me, you're touching on all of the really important things, but there's one thing that jumps out at me in this scene is that Matt, the word that we have been using to describe him over and over and over again is rube, right? He is the guy who is just like, I see it, I like it, I do it, I believe it, right? He's the Jason Mendoza of the group, right? And so in this sequence, to see him, he's almost like a little slimy, right? Like Rand's like, okay, it's great, it's no problem, you have this dagger, we'll just sell it. And Matt's like, well, maybe, kind of, sort of. He's like, we could tell Tom. He's like, no, I don't trust anyone. And so to see Matt not be Rube Matt, and to be, really close to the vest, selfish almost Matt, I think there's something going on here, just in the way he's interacting with Rand. And I think you're right to highlight just how this is one of those moments where the problem could be solved by telling someone something, and it is Matt who has told everyone everything so far,
Right,
who is insisting on silence on this particular thing.
well, and it's interesting to think about that, because he is the one who they really tried to train to keep his mouth shut. And so that, compared to what we saw with Egwene and Perrin having such a good story quickly, it's like it is like that was a good version of character growth, and this is a kind of twisted, manipulated version because it's focused on this object. And so much fantasy has demons or spirits that live on in objects or can control their owners. It's like, oh, is he falling for the spell of this? And again, Lord of the Rings is obviously strongly on my mind. It feels a little Gollumish, a little mine, my own. But could it be something more sinister, where it's going to draw his actions from it? And it is notable to me, we have Rand's sword and now this dagger. We're accumulating a lot more of these objects that mean more than just the object itself.
Yeah, and I like, this is kind of our first instance that we've had of that is something from outside of the area that these boys grew up in, right? Even like Tam's sword or Perrin's axe, they all kind of felt, lived in and, associated with where they're from. And so to now see the first of these items that is something foreign and from someplace that is epically dark, I think it's an interesting contrast to some of the other kind of big markers that we've had along the path.
And again, it's just incredible to me that we're just accumulating so much that's inspiring curiosity, right? And again, some of our reading is just I think suffering a little because we did just take a long break. I went on vacation. You're about to go on vacation, so it'll be a little while till we record. We're burning through some of those ones we banked. And it is just a way in which, like, we accumulate these strands, and I'm so curious about, and it's so easy in this style to kind of forget entirely about one or more of them. And I imagine even people listening along, reading week to week, may find that they forget about just because of the richness of the others. But the way Robert Jordan can bring these back up, right? The dagger comes back up and it's like, oh, right, I know exactly where that's from and what happened. And, it doesn't make me feel stupid or forgetful or something. I'm just carrying it along. And so I think while this accumulation could start to feel overwhelming, I think he has kind of found the right way to play this to always welcome you back into each strand.
Yeah, and to me, this is why I am intrigued by Robert Jordan's use of dreams and prophecy in a way that I often am not in other stories, right? Is sometimes I feel like we get like prophecies and stories where I feel like there are 12 strands and you told me how 2 of them are going to intersect and there's nothing clever about that. But there's something to me really impressive about the way that Robert Jordan just juggles in these books and has so many balls in the air all at once. And so to some degree, calling your shot is a lot more impressive when the thing you're doing is difficult, right? And that's what I think Robert Jordan is doing with his prophecies, right? Is he's saying, look at how many balls I have in the air, and the red one is going to do something cool in 30 seconds, right? And that, I think, is a much more interesting use of prophecy, just because it both gives you that like cleverness that I think authors are after when they write prophecy, but it also is just really helpful for there are 50 things happening in these books. Oh, yeah. That one someone mentioned in a prophecy. I know that's the one.
Yeah. And, again, from our conversations, the thing that has deeply excited me the most is, again, this idea of like deep time and that like, could this be our world and all those things we talked about so many chapters ago. And I was like, well, that's been gone forever. Yeah. And yet you're so excited with it, like ticking away in the background. And the best moments for me reading Game of Thrones, which in the deleted introduction to this episode, I said this was a Game of Thrones podcast for some reason. But when I was reading Game of Thrones, that was always what was the most exciting to me. It's like, oh, we're dealing with this specific interpersonal conflict in King's Landing while Daenerys is kind of ticking away, coming. And does Daenerys even matter if the White Walkers come? And it's like these layers that add tension on top of each other. Just it makes it a really rich experience when you're reading one of these. And so that every kind of plot that gets resolved, or we're not really resolving plots now, but we're answering questions. And so it's like, oh, okay, that's the answer. That now I know what the one power is or what have you. It just, there's still so much ticking away behind the scenes that you're like, oh, well, then how does that inform the next piece and the next piece? So I don't know, your juggling metaphor was better because it was topical to the chapter, but I do think it's just all my way of saying that I continue to find this really exciting. So do you have anything else for this chapter?
I actually just had one thing that what you were talking about reminded me of. You talked about kind of the, how much you love like deep time in this series, and I do as well. And I think there's actually something in here that I'm pretty sure is just my head canon and is not actual canon. But when Bail Domon is describing all of the wonders that he's seen around the world, he describes like a 50-foot tall hand that is grasping a giant crystal, and he describes a number of things. One of the things that he describes is a mountain where the top is hollowed out in a dome, and inside of that dome is a metal spire, and anyone who gets within, I think he says like a mile, dies. And I don't know whether this is accurate. I have always assumed that that was in some way either like a nuclear testing site or a nuclear reactor or something. The way that it's phrased as it's not people who go there die when they're there. It's anyone who goes there dies. And then the fact that we get like a crater like formation, I have always taken that as like there was a missile that blew up somewhere, and now anyone who gets close dies of radiation poisoning, even though they don't know it. So, and
potentially when we're many centuries later. Interesting.
Exactly. Yeah. So that is my one deep time.
You're throwing me a bone, is what you're saying.
Absolutely.
Pay more attention. Awesome. Hey, I don't know if this is true in whatever edition you're reading, but next episode, we hit halfway through my edition. So next week, we will be covering chapter 25, The Traveling People, and chapter 26, White Bridge. And that puts us, I think, in my edition, we're at about page 400 and 420 is halfway. So that kicks us into the back half of the book, which is crazy and exciting. And I'm, you know, as I think our conversation makes clear, I'm having an awesome time reading this and sharing it with you, and hopefully with our listeners. We're still just getting kind of dribs and drabs of interaction, hearing from people, and we love it. The more, the merrier. If you can reach out to us, I know the standard bumper will tell you how to do so, but please reach out if you're enjoying the show or if you have suggestions about the show. I will listen. Tyler will not. But we hope this is just as fun for you all as it is for us. So, Tyler, I just did the majority of the wrapping up, but I want to throw it back to you. Anything you want to add or note?
I just wanted to know, you mentioned that we are getting basically towards around the halfway mark of what I am going to refer to as the fully adult edition. We mentioned in the very first episode that there was a young adult edition that split the books in half. I believe Flight Down the Arinelle, I forget whether it's the last chapter of the first book or the first chapter of the second book, but we are now officially past halfway in the young adult rather than fully adult edition. And let me tell you, next week is two of my favorite chapters in this book. So tune in, get excited, because next time that we go through the glass columns, we are going to go all the way through the glass columns.
So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, or Amazon. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, you can email us at throughtheglasscolumns@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Twitter by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to the show, leave us a review wherever you're listening, and recommend the show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time through the Glass Columns.